Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Sven Spengemann on Reconstituting Iraq, From Power to Process. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I welcome you here into the studio at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, some noted expert on some aspect of global governance. Today I'm very happy to welcome Sven Spengemann, who is a Senior Constitutional Officer for the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, currently on leave and a visiting scholar at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Welcome, Sven, and we have to tell the audience that you're here as an expert, but to express your personal views and not the views of the United Nations as an organization, even though you do work for them. But we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Iraq is one of those interesting parts of the world that preoccupied us for years and years and years, and all of a sudden, we don't hear much about it at the moment, and perhaps that's good news. Maybe that means that you and your colleagues in Baghdad have actually been doing a good job solving some of the problems that kept Iraq in the headlines. So we will talk about that, but first, just to orient us to the issues you've been dealing with in Iraq, maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself, your background, how you came to this particular assignment, and go from there.
Thank you very much. Very good to be with you. Very happy to be at the Balsillie School during this UN sabbatical. Very grateful for the opportunity to extract myself for a while from the reality on the ground, do some thinking and reflecting on the experiences I've had for the last 6 years. Iraq really has come through a number of twists and turns since 2003. For me, it's been one of the most interesting, one of the most challenging experiences professionally, personally, emotionally that I've had so far. I've done a number of things before joining the UN. I've done some work in the private sector, in financial services. I've worked in government in the Privy Council office in Ottawa for a couple of years. I've worked in legal practice and then basically came across the opportunity in mid-2005 to join the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq. Things came together in a number of respects. It was something that I had studied for academically, that I had thought about personally. Very interested in global affairs, very interested in the paradigm of liberal constitutional democracy. So here was a chance to step to the side of a country that needed some assistance on finding its way forward. So I did a quick risk assessment and decided in October 2005 to get into the field. And I've been working more or less 95% of the time in Baghdad on the ground inside the Green Zone.
What was your attitude when you started? Were you optimistic and hopeful that here was a real opportunity that Iraq could be transformed from a brutal authoritarian dictatorship into a thriving constitutional democracy? Or, like many others, were you really skeptical that this was fertile soil and you weren't sure that this was going to work?
2005 were dark days. I mean, the newspaper headlines were just overwhelmingly about attacks, body counts, violence on the threshold of civil war, ethnic sectarian strife of quite some intensity. So in the short term, I think everybody was quite skeptical. What drew me to the problem was its complexity. A number of different disciplines came together, not just law, but also politics, economics, a lot of social and cultural issues that were important and had to be realigned. But also the fundamentals. Iraq, if there is a project that could succeed, not necessarily in a political federalist sense, but in terms of cultural coexistence with some deep fissures, but also a common history and a very significant resource that could pull it all together. It could be the one example in the region that really could come out front and become a success story. So in a way that attracted me to the problem. My initial function wasn't that of political or constitutional work. I joined the mission in a legal capacity, more or less as an in-house counsel for 2 years, and it gave me a chance to really get to know the organization in some detail, both in the field and its relations with headquarters and with the host governments of Jordan, Kuwait, and Iraq.
As legal counsel, who were you advising and on what kinds of issues?
Basically the senior management of the mission on issues like legal agreements. We had agreements in place with Jordan and with Kuwait, and working on an agreement with Iraq. We also embarked on a fairly complex negotiation with the multinational force, the then multinational force Iraq, on the provision of security and emergency medical assistance to the UN. And I also dealt with contracting issues, staff disciplinary issues, procurement oversight. So basically the nuts and bolts of a general counsel practice, but on the ground in Baghdad, which required a fair amount of flexibility and agility in terms of getting things done.
And that morphed into constitution making.
Correct. Yeah, my real interest, my academic interest, my professional interest was in the area of constitutional systems and rebuilding, particularly transitional democracies or countries aspiring to be democratic in nature. And so in early 2007, I had the opportunity to join the constitutional team and to ultimately lead this team. It's a fairly small team of international experts nestled in the political wing of the UN mission on the ground in Baghdad.
Mm-hmm. And is it fair to say that Canadians were well represented on this? Because we had, at least in the broader penumbra of the community, this team was working with and consulting because of Canada's experience with multiculturalism and trying to negotiate differences. Absolutely,
yes. Not necessarily in terms of the number of people on the ground. There were a number of Canadians on the ground in various capacities, as there usually are in the mission. We tend to do quite well in the UN. We also had some very direct assistance through an implementing partner, the Forum of Federations, an Ottawa-based think tank, to which a number of federal countries belong as members, who gave some comparative assistance insight into rebuilding Iraq in a federalist paradigm.
Mm-hmm. And was that work rewarding while you were doing it, or was it primarily frustrating?
It was rewarding. You have to think about this in terms of a number of different layers or functions that somebody on the ground as a UN official would have. It's not necessarily just the daily work and the gratification or lack thereof that can come, but simply the fact that UN presence on the ground tends to mean something. We like to think that because we're there, people will behave a little bit differently than if we were not. So there's a representational function to simply keep the flag up in a combat zone or a conflict zone of this kind, and to show people that the spotlights, the eyes of the world are there, and the ability and willingness to assist is there. That's very crucial. I think at one point we went down to a threshold of only some 55 international staff, so a very minimalist presence in the dark days of 2005, 2006, but nonetheless important, I think, to have a continuous presence on the ground. Our work in the political team is very incremental. As you know from the headlines, the process is almost stalemated, going very, very slowly. So you have to scale back your expectations in terms of personal gratification and results. What we have done effectively, I think, was to get going a number of discussions on such topics as hydrocarbon management. There's a package of 4 pieces of legislation that still needs to go through the Iraqi Council of Representatives. And we've taken early steps to get parliamentarians to talk to each other, and more importantly, to get parliamentarians to speak to elements of the executive. The executive is still divided along sectarian lines, which is very atypical in a functional democracy, but various sectarian blocs hold various ministries, and these ministries are not always in tune with each other, nor are they in tune with their legislature. So these early steps of establishing dialogue were quite rewarding, and in a way the message came back to us from the Iraqi leaders that otherwise, were it not for us, those kinds of conversations would not have happened.
Well, that's a strong signal of confidence. We'll be back again with Sven Spengemann in just a moment. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of constitutionality in Iraq, and walk us through, if you will, what it was like when you started dealing with a file and what it's like today. What are the issues that have basically been dealt with? What are the issues that still pending? And which issues, if any, look like they're going to be very, very long-term projects?
Yeah, David, that's an important question. Much of the constitutional project is stalemated. What happened was that in 2005, at the conclusion of the constitutional process, the parties decided basically to insert a constitutional amendment clause in Article 142, which more or less from the outset recognized that the Constitution achieved in 2005 wasn't a full reflection of the political equilibrium, in particular since the Sunni community did not have the voice that it needed to really make its own rights heard at the negotiating table. So the Article 142 amendment process is still one that's live today. A number of significant issues that still need to be addressed under it and haven't yet been, including the status of Kirkuk, the contested oil-rich area in northern Iraq, to which there are a number of competing and, in the eyes of some, irreconcilable historical and cultural narratives. A very important project, and that needs to be addressed through the lens of what is now in the Constitution, Article 140. There are other issues, as I mentioned, on oil and gas. There are not only legislative gaps on the hydrocarbon side, but also constitutional gaps in terms of the provisions that divide basically the ownership rights across the population of Iraq. And then there's a number of other ones. The status of women under Article 41, the application of Sharia law is one issue that has been raised in the past, has not been resolved, perhaps not as a priority at the moment, but would need to be addressed in the future. So the general thinking is that the constitutional file conservative as they are, constitutions take a long time to amend. Might be one that will be put on a side burner for a while, and that some projects could be implemented or more easily achieved through the legislative track. And then later on, there'll be a constitutional updrift of some of these files into the constitutional framework, and a subsequent referendum would have to be passed again. So the population of Iraq once more would have to go to the polls and say, okay, we like the amended constitution as a more fair, more equitable reflection of the political equilibrium that we've achieved for the last over the course of the last 7 years.
Now, if you're a citizen of Iraq, who's governing you? If you live in which part of the country, who do you look to as a public authority? Do you look to Baghdad, only in Baghdad? Do you look to the Kurdish leadership if you're in the northern part of the country? How's that actually operating on the ground?
Right. That also is an extremely important question. Iraq is divided into a number of different levels of government. You have the federal center. You have regions, which have notionally less power than the center, but more power than the governorate, which is the third level. The only existing region at the moment is the Kurdistan region. It's recognized constitutionally. But under the constitution, other provinces also have the right to aspire to regional status. And then below the provincial level, you have districts and sub-districts. So municipal districts and municipal governorates, or governance levels, essentially. So for the population, it's still a little bit unclear, and it's in a way it's a risky view forward, in the sense that if you have failure at multiple levels of government, the population ultimately will ask itself, well, what's this whole constitutional project for? If the Constitution outlines 4 or 5 different levels of government, but none of them really provide me the services that I, as an Iraqi citizen, have a right to or have expected in the past. There may be a disenfranchisement or a disenchantment with the process of liberal constitutional democracy as a whole. So I think that's where I see the danger points. At least one, if not more, of these levels really do need to ultimately come up to the plate and provide levels of public services and goods that are acceptable to the public.
And are there parts of the country that are working well? If you ask people on the ground,
the picture is mixed. There are still a number of areas where levels are below par, and the UN has written some reports on needs assessments and on gaps that exist at the moment. The Kurdistan region notionally has been the one area of Iraq that's been held up as being economically, anyway, more advanced than others, even though there's still work to be done there. In the south, things tend to be relatively more homogeneous, so things are notionally functional. Certainly in terms of security, the picture has stabilized quite a bit from the days of 2005, 2006, and I think that's one of the areas for which the Prime Minister has received credit in 2008 to have led an operation known under the name of Charge of the Knights against militias in the south, basically against his own people. So the population really has recognized that as something that's contributed to the current stability of the country. But aside from the security paradigm, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of healthcare, education, infrastructure, oil infrastructure included, and public finance. So the question at the moment is, if the center doesn't provide what's expected, will there now be a trend towards greater decentralization than we already have in this constitution? And if that's the case, can the provincial and regional levels fill those gaps that the federal government so far has not been able to fill?
And how much of the domestic governance is being supplied still by international actors, UN or NGOs?
It's becoming less and less. Along with the drawdown of the US military and budgetary constraints that the West faces, there's now a devolution onto the Iraqis that's quite progressive. We're more than willing to continue to provide comparative assistance and expertise, and that's the reflection of the UN mission being there still in a political capacity as much as it is in a humanitarian and development capacity. But increasingly the sense among the donor community is that Iraq has the resources to bootstrap itself out of the gaps that still exist. And that it could request the expertise, and that certainly the technical answers can be provided easily. What's missing is the political will, and that's something that really has to be endogenous within the Iraqi apparatus.
And do the neighbors want it to succeed?
That's a very, very difficult question to answer. I mean, it is certainly scholars that point to the fact that certain countries do not want a democracy to be established in Iraq. I think Iraq is struggling to maintain the political independence to find its own way forward. It's very difficult for politicians, being so closely aligned on either side of the various fences with neighboring countries, to do that. So the political realities are messy, are perhaps not conducive to the sort of rarefied or abstract picture that Iraq could just be a federation, a functional federation tomorrow, if people would stop interfering.
Right. Well, a series of challenges everywhere in that part of the world.
Absolutely.
We'll be back again with Sven Spengemann in just a moment. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org. on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Sven, you mentioned something that particularly caught my ear, which is the debate about the role of Sharia in Iraq. Of course, under the rule of the Ba'athist Party, Iraq was a secular republic and not officially an Islamic state in the sense of being ruled by Sharia, Islamic law. Can you tell us a bit more about the state of play there? Obviously, Iraq is a Muslim country, predominantly Sunni, minority Shia. But different attitudes, I suppose, you would know better than I, within both of those communities about the importance of trying to recognize the role of Sharia in day-to-day life and in governance of the country.
The issue is not at the forefront. It's a latent issue. It's one that needs to be addressed from a number of different angles. Islam is seen as a fundamental source of law under the Iraqi constitution. It's very early on, I think even Article 1 of the constitution. It is not the source, but it's certainly one. And there shall be no law that is passed that contradicts the established practices of Islam. That's the constitutional text as I have it in my recollection. The question then is, what are the established principles of Islam? Who expounds them? The Constitution calls for a new constitutional court. It currently has, the country has a federal Supreme Court, which under new legislation would basically be reconstituted to be the supreme and final arbiter of the Constitution. And it is to have Islamic judges as part of the bench that adjudicates questions under Iraqi law. So the question then is, okay, if and when these things move forwards, the questions, the religious questions, what direction will the country take? Will it take a moderate one? Will it take a more progressive one? What kind of discords may come out of that socially if there are controversial issues rendered by this court? That's still quite some ways down the road in terms of actually happening on the ground. The other thing that I mentioned was Article 41, that's the status of women. That's one of the controversial provisions in the Constitution that may bring these questions out sooner than later. There were some efforts by the previous Constitutional Review Committee to write a consensus clause that would basically draw a sufficient constitutional consensus and make stakeholders happy that there be optional opt-outs out of Sharia law, especially on the status of women, that if they're ethnic minorities, religious minorities that do not subscribe to these provisions, that they be treated under their own respective religious or
would these be opt-outs that individuals could exercise?
That's an open question. Probably less likely individuals than certain subgroups, minorities that are recognized under Article 125 of the Constitution. But again, it becomes subject to the interpretation of this particular court. So the religious questions aren't in the forefront, but there's certainly ones that later on in the progress of constitutional amendments will be addressed, will need to be addressed in Iraq to maintain a functional social fabric across all parts of the federation.
And are religious authorities in Iraq positioning themselves to make a pitch for a greater political role in the future, or are they holding back and basically like participating as minimally as necessary?
There are a number of current and former clerics in the apparatus. One of the more radical voices that's been held up in the media is that of Muqtada al-Sadr. Muqtada al-Sadr, as we know, spent a number of years preparing for religious status in Iran and has a large following, is able to mobilize large numbers of people in the street, has taken a very strong anti-American, anti-occupation position. It'll be very interesting to see how he evolves politically over the course of the coming years now with the US drawdown, given that his position basically has more or less been met. The American forces have withdrawn or will withdraw to near zero status very progressively. Where will he turn next? Will he compete with other Shia clergy in the apparatus in the sense of wanting to hand out public goods or services? Or will he continue the sort of more radical extreme religious ideology that he's pursued in the past? Open question, one that we certainly need to keep an eye on.
And how is he seen by other members of the Shia community who are not followers of him in particular? And how is he seen by Sunni religious leaders? I imagine that's an easier question to answer.
Sure, there's polarization within the Shia community. I mean, there's cohesion within the Shia community, certainly under the authority of al-Sistani. But there's also competition. There's definitely Shia competition, especially once a cleric or a religious figure has decided to enter the political fray. Hopefully it'll be a process of political negotiation and accommodation ultimately, rather than remilitarization, and we need to be optimistic on that front. And so far, Muqtada al-Sadr has received credit for having his militia stand down following the operation of the Charge of the Knights in 2008.
And how strong is the advocacy for secular politics in Iraq? Is there a significant westernized, cosmopolitan, international, politically active community? And if so, are they only in Baghdad, or are they represented elsewhere also?
Westernized might be overstating it, but certainly Western-oriented. In some respects, there's an elite that's Western-educated, not only among the Kurdish leadership, but also in parts in Baghdad and in the Shiite and Sunni community. Certainly a current of moderate secularist thinking that's emerged in Baghdad, especially post the ethnic violence in 2005, 2006. I think people really realized that religious polarization, radicalization wasn't going to be the future of this country. There would have to be a stepping back from that, and some sort of more secular, more moderate vision of government would have to emerge. The problem is that there's tremendous competition within that paradigm across the sectarian religious lines. Within the moderate paradigm. So the end result being at the moment is that we're still politically quite deadlocked on many of the issues that really would need to be decided for the country to truly turn a corner towards more effective and more representative government.
And do you think there's anything that the occupation could have done differently that would have made this particular task you've been involved in easier? I mean, as you said at the beginning, the bad news stories were everywhere for the first couple of years after the conquest, and one always wonders if the United States had gone in with a different attitude, a different set of priorities, maybe your job would have been easier, or not? Hard to say.
The counterfactual is hard to posit. Sure, the presumption is there. There's some. I mean, the literature is out there now, and it's growing. That there's some mistakes that were made early on, especially in the mid 2003 to late 2003 paradigm. Not to say that it was a U.S. political decision that really caused the derailments of the process, but I think that it was more the notion that there was a period over which a power vacuum was not addressed, and the Western coalition that was in the country at the time sort of let it fill endogenously, and it was filled not by sort of constructive, unified, positive thinking, but really by very extreme sectarian positions, which are the easiest positions to take. That's the easiest, most rapid, and most effective way to fill a political vacuum. Is just take polarized positions without having to think through any of the governance paradigms or the ideal form of government that Iraq could take on in the future. So that was the consequence of that in 2004 that ultimately led to the civil violence and the sectarian slaughter that we saw. I should say that from our perspective on the ground, and we were asked this a number of times by representatives of the U.S. government, the Government Accountability Office, there was a noticeable difference through the surge. The surge did make a difference. To bring 30,000 additional troops onto the ground really contributed to the stability, the relative stability that we see now, in addition to Maliki having taken the decision, as I mentioned earlier, to crack down on the militias. So there was some correction. Yeah, just to return to your question, I mean, it's were there mistakes made? Yes, definitely. Could things have been done differently? Probably. One thing I think that hampers the U.S. military, and in many respects I've worked with very capable people in the U.S. Armed Forces on governance issues. They're very, very short rotation schedules, at times even less than 6 months. And it's very difficult for an officer to come in and to build a rapport with the Iraqi leadership over a 3 to 6 month window. 2 or 3 months into the cycle, she's then writing her handover notes to the successor.
You learn the ropes in your home.
Exactly. It's very tough to build the relationships that you need to really be trusted by the Iraqi leaders.
Well, very good. We'll be back one more time with Sven Spengemann. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So about a year ago now, the Arab Spring began unexpectedly everywhere, in Tunisia initially, and then throughout the Arab world. Interestingly, Iraq hasn't been in the headlines much during the coverage of the Arab Spring. I wonder if you could give us a sense of how the Arab Spring and developments in the broader region have been affecting developments in Iraq, or perhaps vice versa. Maybe conceivably what had been happening in Iraq was in some sense inspirational for the Arab Spring.
These are interesting questions. I should say at the outset, when I applied for the UN sabbatical in November of last year, none of this was on the horizon. I was basically going to just go into the ivory towers and write a literature review on transitional democracy and maybe pass some recommendations on Iraq. Then in January along came this wave of protests, very rapid, very extensive, very forceful in a way, sort of suggesting latent levels of dissatisfaction that had been there for quite some time and really were venting very quickly through the social media. Definitely has had an effect on Iraq. There were people on the streets, not nearly with the same magnitude or intensity as elsewhere, and I think credit goes there to the role of the religious clergy, who basically told people to sort of keep it in bounds. But certainly the Iraqi government received a message that if things were to continue to be less than optimal and dissatisfactory, the Iraqi public could voice its discontent and could take to the streets. Nestled in the broader context of the Arab Spring, I think Iraq remains a very important country strategically because of its cleavages, because of the Arab-Persian divide, the Kurdish-Arab divide, and again, a country that many of the neighbors will look to in terms of how it reacts and how it could potentially take on a leadership role to turn not only itself but the region as a whole into a more positive direction.
And who were the people in the streets in Iraq? Was it the same demographic as the people in other Arab Spring countries? Or?
I would say yes. You would probably have seen, I wasn't on the streets, we didn't receive the most accurate reports. Probably the lower socioeconomic strata, certainly people in Sadr City and other regions that really suffered most directly, that may have seen the crass difference between the lifestyle they had before the fall of Saddam even and what was happening from 2005 onwards, saying, why has this change in government really not brought me any tangible benefits on the ground? But certainly also inspired through social media by what was going on in other countries in the region.
And at the time, as these events were unfolding, we all assumed that this was genuine pro-democracy sentiment, that people were coming out in the streets of various Arab capitals demanding a right to have a voice and a say in their government. One wonders now whether or not it was more pro-democracy sentiment or anti-corruption sentiment or simply anti-tired, aging, authoritarian rulers sentiment. And one also wonders, where was Islam in all this? Why did it not sort of take front stage during the course of these demonstrations in various capitals, and what role will it play in the aftermath?
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that there's a big chasm conceptually between protesting against something and then actually being put into positions where you could design a future for the country, positions of power. So much of this, as much as we've seen here on in North America with the Occupy movements, these are protests against ossified anachronisms, basically, of government that are no longer functional, that have resulted in socioeconomic cleavages that are not acceptable. At the same time, there was probably much less thinking about what would happen next. And I think this is really the call on the international community, and particularly those people that have some expertise in governance, to try to provide now in some non-interventionist, neutral but principled way, mechanisms that these new leadership cadres could draw on and could try to design something for the future of their respective countries. The real fear is, and you mentioned Islam, the real fear in the literature that I've seen in my studies over the last 3 months is that if there's continued suboptimalities in the delivery of public services following this protest wave, if there's no equalization, no social welfare systems that are being designed, especially in the face of the tremendous wealth, the hydrocarbon wealth that some of these countries have, that there be, again, disappointment with or disillusionment vis-a-vis the process of democracy. And that would provide fertile ground for religious leaders, non-moderate, extremist religious leaders to come in and say, okay, we have a different answer to this, and let's try that. So far, I think the Islamic currents have stood on the sidelines, have been moderately sympathetic with the protesters, but are really trying to figure out how to politically position themselves. And I think Islam continues to be very much a force. Moderate Islam cannot be disregarded as a political force in that region, has to be dealt with, has to be integrated into the political picture that's emerging, but with some eye towards the alienation of radical views that are not compatible with the system, the emerging system as a whole. So it's less about democracy than it is about liberalization, freedom perhaps. Freedom in the Arab world is a concept that more easily translates into justice, some form of social justice, but not necessarily the kind of democracy that we see or are comfortable with in the West.
And how has your view of Canada changed now that you've been back for a little bit from that particularly interesting part of the world?
It's been a tremendous privilege for me to look back on Canada with the now 6 years experience in the Middle East. I mean, I've taken so much for granted in this country that really has come around in a very different way, and I'm refreshed, I'm rejuvenated by being at home. I see some challenges ahead for Canada, but also tremendous reasons to be optimistic. Canada really is a microcosm of the world by virtue of our demographics, and a very rich one at that, a very intellectual one. And we've got lots to be thankful for, lots to be optimistic about.
We certainly do, and we're thankful for you spending time with us this year at the Balsillie School, but also today in the studio, and hope to have you back again sometime to talk further about your experiences as they unfold. And to our audience, please join us next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.